Welcome to today's event. My name is Michel Hawks, and I'm the director of the Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies at the University of Notre Dame. The Liu Institute is one of 9 constituent international institutes of the Keough School for Global Affairs. Our main tasks are to coordinate Asian studies research and teaching across all schools and departments in the university, to encourage Notre Dame students to study in Asia, to promote academic collaboration with Asian universities, and to organize public events pertaining to Asia. This academic year, we celebrate the 10th anniversary of the generous gift from the Liu family that led to the founding of our institute. As part of these celebrations, we are highlighting some of the research on Asia done by our own faculty fellows. It gives me tremendous pleasure, therefore, to introduce to you my esteemed colleague, Professor Julia Thomas. As one of the Western world's leading intellectual historians of Japan, Professor Thomas has written extensively about Japanese political ideology and the rise of fascism. In addition to that work, she has made major contributions to the historical study of Japanese concepts of nature, and she is now a leading voice in the global debates about the Anthropocene. Her title today is Anthropocene Lessons from Japanese History. During the event, if you have any questions, please submit them using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. The event will conclude promptly at 12 noon. And now, with great pleasure, I yield the floor to Professor Julia Thomas.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. I want to give special thanks to the Liu Institute, to Michelle, Alyssa, Chris, and Megan, who are keeping us all on track and keeping us looking to the future, even as we struggle through this pandemic and the political turmoil that we've all been experiencing. I want to start today with a PowerPoint, and I hope it's coming up. Wonderful. Okay, from the beginning. As many of you know, I have had the privilege and pleasure of working with scientists, the leading scientists who are thinking about the Anthropocene, beginning to conceptualize this new geological epoch. And what I have learned, perhaps more than anything from them, is that we need to think of our planet as a single system, as a single integrated system. Now, this may seem a very long way from Japanese history, but what I'm going to do today is connect this Earth system with my work on early modern Japan. Because one of the great questions for me is, if we have indeed entered a new geological epoch, a different time in Earth's history, then we're going to have to think differently about human history. And one of the arguments I'm going to make, just in case you have to leave early, is that we can find in Tokugawa Japan, in early modern Japan, between 1600 and 1868, at least some clues as to how to have a hopeful history, at least if we modify the idea of hope. So I'm going to begin by explaining some of the science and then move into what I'm doing with Japan. So the Earth system is a whole. It works as an integrated unit. And this is a very new idea in the sciences. It emerges in the 1980s. It is out of Earth system science that Paul Cruikshank arises and comes up with the term Anthropocene. And what scientists are now discovering is that although we used to be, and still would like to be, but are not, in this nice green center of the Earth system, we are in fact pushing against planetary boundaries into dangerous territory. And you can see that as these trajectories and these sectors spread out into red. Interestingly enough, climate change is only the 4th most dangerous boundary. And that shows how we have to reconceptualize the Earth as a problem of climate change, certainly, but also related to everything else that's going on, particularly biodiversity loss. We have lost more than half of the terrestrial mass of land animals in the last 50 years. Biochemical flows of nitrogen and phosphorus are creating dead zones in the ocean that no longer produce the oxygen that we breathe. And land use change is the third most dramatic change to the Earth's surface. We are impacting up to 95% of the terrestrial land surface. And we are going to have to use more land as we feed more people in the future. In fact, they're projecting a population of up to 11 billion people by 2100. And each of those people, of course, need to eat, they need to breathe, they need fresh water. And this is an enormous challenge. So climate change is the fourth biggest problem we face. Carbon in the air has now risen to levels that we haven't seen in 800,000 years. And a lot of this is driven by global inequality. So it's also a social problem. Growing inequality means that more and more people live with less and less of the global pie. So how are we going to think of this? Well, what my scientist friends like Will Steffen are teaching me is that in this lower quadrant in the left lower hand, the planet used to go on 100,000 year cycles between ice ages and warming bits, and another ice age and a warming bit. That lasted for 2.6 million years. These numbers are very difficult for scientists. I want you to be impressed that I've managed to commit to memory any number with so many zeros. But the problem is that we are pushing the Earth now. Human collective agency is pushing the Earth up to what is about B here. And if we continue with business as usual, we are going to head towards what is now called hothouse Earth, which may not be inhabitable. That's where we're headed. Well, I'm an historian. I can't do this kind of science. I listen to these things and I think about Walter Benjamin's angel of history. This is just one catastrophe building on another, on another, on another. And the angel of history is blown backwards, watching this ever mountainous mass of destruction accrete in front of him. And that's not an incorrect way of looking at this. I see that as a possible story of where we are now. But that's not the story I want to tell. And when I look at the faces of my students, when I look at my friends and indeed everyone, that's not the only story I hope we can find. So I'm trying to figure out how to have another angel of history. And the reason I'm doing this is that there are some ways of telling this story of the emergence of the Anthropocene, of our destruction of the Earth system, that I don't like, that I find to be quite devastating, in fact, to those who hope that there is something that can be rescued from history. That so that we can tell the story of the past in a way that allows maybe not for complete emancipation, maybe not for true utopia, but for at least a way forward. And here I'm thinking particularly of Antonio Gramsci, the great Italian Marxist theorist, who said that we, of course, have pessimism of the intellect. We know things are going wrong, but we have to have optimism of the will. And yet so many of the stories that we are told these days about the Anthropocene are in fact deeply pessimistic. One of them that is gaining followers and is certainly a reasonable way to tell the story is that human beings were always destined to overwhelm the planet. That there is something about our amazing capacities for social organization and taking advantage of our environment that has pushed us along, even through the tough times of the ice ages, so that there is something inevitable about our overwhelming the planet. And indeed, there are historians who argue this, like Ian Morris, who will argue that if there were hominin creatures on another planet like Earth, they too would destroy that planet. And we have arguments like that of Kyle Harper, who looks at the way we've mastered microorganisms and basically disinfected the planet to allow our population to grow. That means that we will inevitably dominate the Earth system. I can see that big history working. I can see how you can tell the story that way. But my point is not that that story is untrue, only that it leaves us with no hope. Another way of telling the story, one that is quite forcefully and beautifully told by a historian at Yale, Jim Scott, is that the real problem was that we had agriculture. We really need to flee to the mountains to live hunter-gatherer lifestyles and learn to live lives very much more simply. I can see the appeal of that. Like Jim Scott, I'm from Appalachia. I believe in the mountains, but that's not feasible for 8 billion people, 11 billion people. To go back to a pre-agrarian society is simply not in our future in any happy way. A third version, very, very popular among the scientists, and to me quite alarming, is to suggest that the technosphere, all that human beings make and all that we are, they even include our music and our dreams in the technosphere, has now expanded beyond us, so that our only role now is to serve this technosphere, to which we are an essential part, but a subordinate part. The reason I object to all the three ways of telling this story is that they leave us no sense of possible agency and agency toward creating the humanistic values that those of us in history and in the arts and literature care so much about. Where does the capacity to find the right word to persuade people figure in any of these histories? How does being neighborly figure in any of these histories? How does our sense of community and communion figure in these histories when they foretell either disaster or slavery to the technosphere or an impossible return to pre-agrarian societies? So I want to try to do something else. This angel of history is an angel of despair. If you tell the stories this way, I don't know where we end up. We end up in a kind of nihilism. And I love this photograph, as some of you know, I'm interested in photography, because the name of the person whose gravestone this in is Story. Here we have a story that is simply nihilistic. I want to find a different kind of angel of history. And I turned for this to the remarkable Rebecca Solnit, who gives us the alternative angel of history. Unlike Walter Benjamin's angel of history, who looks around and says, this is terrible, it just gets more and more terrible. Rebecca Solnit's angel of history says, yeah, it's terrible. I don't disagree, but it could be worse. It could be worse. Now, that's not exactly hope. It's certainly not utopia. It's a kind of gesture toward hope. It's like saying, yeah, let's try. Let's try to make it not perfect, but let's try to get it a little better. And that is what she says perhaps we can do. And I want to show you how this might look looking at Japan. So just in general, this is where the Earth system is going, over these planetary thresholds that will take us to hothouse Earth. If we go over these tipping points or thresholds, we can't go back. This is going to be really bad. What we need to do, according to Will Steffen and other system scientists, is stabilize the Earth right here. It's outside the Holocene. It's not a comfortable place to live. It would be much hotter. There would be much less biodiversity. Carbon is going to remain in the air. There's a lot of problems. But the most frightening thing to me is that the Earth has never been stabilized between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. We've never been here before. So that means this stabilized Earth is entirely artificial. It will require the great inventiveness and capacities of human beings to dedicate themselves to creating a stabilized Earth so that the cycles of the Earth system are not shooting out beyond planetary boundaries, but recycling back to enable us to live mutualistically with our planet. Now, the move I want to make here is to Japanese history. If we consider our planet a closed system, that's mostly right. Of course, there's a lot of heat and energy from the sun, so it's not really a closed system, and there's other things that make it slightly less than closed. If we also compare that to Tokugawa Japan, which was fairly isolated, but not completely closed, we can see perhaps some sort of comparison. Perhaps we can use Tokugawa Japan to think about resilience with decency within a closed system. Now, the period of the Tokugawa was a period during which people were not allowed to leave the island. Japanese people were not allowed to leave the island except on a few official missions. And food was not brought in. So they were essentially required to live off the bounty of these islands. Now, of course, there are loopholes here. There's the sea that brings in fish. They seem to, at the end of this period, have gotten timber from Hokkaido. They get some sugar from Ryukyu Islands and other things. It's not a completely closed system. I understand that. But for the sake of trying to find ways to use history to imagine a way forward in the Anthropocene, the Tokugawa period comes pretty close to an analog of some kind. Close enough, as Rebecca Solnit would say. So let's see how this would look as a closed system. Now, one thing I should say about the Tokugawa Bakufu is that none of us would want to live there. This is not a great place to live. For those of us used to the abundance of a liberal democracy with a strong capitalist system, we don't want to be here, but we also don't want to be in hothouse Earth. So this is better than the other. This is Rebecca Solnit's idea of the alternative age of history. And here we have in Tokugawa Japan a governance system which is strong but decentralized. It's strong in that the Bakufu controls foreign relations, it keeps people at peace, but it allows local areas to make decisions for themselves, partly because the elite is removed into castle towns and they're not on the land, so that peasants are by and large allowed to decide for themselves how they want to use the natural resources in their immediate area. It is also a relatively predictable and non-corrupt system, and it creates peace. Given what we're looking at as we look at the next few decades, this looks a bit better than it may have when we had utopian hopes. The Neo-Confucian ideology, again, is something that is not what I was hoping for. I like the idea of individual liberty, but what if we can't have individual liberty and the kind of self-interested decision-making that has created the strains on the Earth system? What if the goal of communal well-being becomes more important? What if the goal of stability and order become more important than economic growth? And I say these things when I look, because I'm looking at papers that are telling me that by 2050, there are certain parts of the world that are going to be so hot that we are going to get an immigration crisis like we've never seen before, even if we manage to mitigate our climate, our carbon emissions, and things go well. This paper predicts things like 1.5 billion refugees. If we don't manage that, they suggest there may be as many as 3 billion. So I'm not suggesting that any of us become Neo-Confucians. It really isn't my dream. But that ideal of giving up economic growth for well-being and stability in the face of the waves of immigration that we are going to be confronting begins to sound a bit more plausible. One of the things I really like about the Tokugawa model, and where a lot of my own work is focusing, is on village autonomy and local feedback loops. The idea of keeping a small society in the bounds of its local community, making decisions such that their small community survives and doesn't overrun its very local landscape and resources. And that means all sorts of things. It means working a lot harder. They speak of the Tokugawa period as a period where Japan experienced an industrious revolution rather than an industrial one. And so many of us are spending our days sitting in front of a screen. The idea of working as hard as a Tokugawa peasant, seems almost impossible. But in fact, this may be a way of finding hope, harder physical labor, less energy use. We also must remember that the Tokugawa society was a very literate society. Science, arts, publications, and relative tolerance, not a tolerance for Christianity, but relative intellectual and religious tolerance was part of this society. So this is not a draconian society in the sense of insisting on ideological orthodoxy. That too is something to remember. Women's work is vital in this society. That is another lesson we might take home, that societies which value women's work are likely to do well. What's also interesting and counters the work of Walter Schjeldahl, who published a very famous book just a couple of years ago that claims that more equality is never established unless you have warfare. When we look at the Tokugawa period, which was peaceful, we see rising equality between elite and commoner classes, partly because the elite was unwilling to try to capture all the gains in prosperity that was coming from the countryside. This is a society which is very careful about sustainable forest use in its architecture and furnishings. You see here, they're using materials from the forest that are easily renewable. Bamboo poles, bamboo grows very quickly. Small reeds, which of course renew much more quickly than big timber. And a shared space such that they're working and living and therefore only have to heat a single space. Of course, we're sort of doing that now, those of us who are working from home. Even the idea of luxury in Tokugawa Japan was much more was much less material resource intensive than, say, the Victorian period, where you had lots and lots of different rooms dedicated to different things with lots of different materials used for items that had only one purpose. In this kind of space, you can use the space for all different functions. Heating was much more resource conscious in that you heated the body, not the room. And people took care of fabrics, and fabrics could be reused with kimono in a way they can't with Western style clothing during this period. Also, people were not eating uh, much in the way of meat, and there was a great deal of focus on mixed grains and vegetable proteins, and tea drinking. So the Japanese population had um, longer lifespans than other people around the world. So, in many ways, this is a system which works. This cycle of health is supported by sanitation, so that the great cities of Tokugawa Japan, like Edo, are collecting urine and feces from people's houses and treating them to be green fertilizer. So the soil of the fields around these cities is renewed, and they grow healthy vegetables that are brought in into the cities, so that the cities in the Tokugawa period in Japan are actually growing from natural increase, unlike European cities, which are so filthy and dirty that people die off so quickly that the only reason they're able to maintain their population is by drawing in people from the countryside. So there's a cycle here that is working in Japan. Maybe the idea of going around and collecting human excrement is, not so attractive to many of us, but we must remember that there are already societies that are beginning to look at this as a way forward. Singapore, for instance, treats its wastewater and makes it into drinking water today. So this is a way we are heading. The most astounding thing, perhaps, about Japanese society during this period is that its population levels off for about 100 years. And this allows well-being to grow while the population stabilizes at about 30 million. Now, that doesn't sound like much to us, but it is comparatively large. Japan has more people than any other European country than Russia, although only 15% approximately of the Japanese islands is arable. So that though the population is quite dense, it is comparatively large. What seems to have done the trick here in leveling off the population is not, as earlier historians used to think, famines, but a new rule, which was that only one of your children could inherit land. And if all of your children are not going to be provided for, partly because the land area is running out and you can't keep subdividing it, families begin to be interested in having fewer children. And so Japan develops what we might think of as kind of a nuclear family model. It's not got a large population, lots and lots of children. In fact, people begin to marry much later. People begin to send young people out to work elsewhere and then come back and marry when they're 28 or 30, so they're not having lots and lots of children. And then they do things like hope to limit their children by naming the child that they hope is their last child, Mr. Final Child, Misago, the end. That doesn't really work as birth control. But in some areas, they not only do all these things, but they are also practice infanticide. That is much objected to by the Tokugawa Bakufu. But some communities looking at their immediate resources begin, it seems, to enforce that very draconian method. So interesting things are happening here in Japan. And they seem to have been able to create short ecological feedback loops controlled locally that allowed those areas to keep the small villages to keep in sync with their natural environment. And there was no ideology of growth for growth's sake. And I think that that helped an enormous amount. The elite was not pushing growth. There are also the idea of learning, science, relative gender equity, and increasing, although accidental, greater equity among the classes, and this stable population. But so much of this, including the peace that descended on this period, was sheer luck. So the question is, can we hope at all to apply this to the problems that we face today? Can we imagine mutualistic societies where our cities sink into the terrain and actually begin to regenerate biodiversity, help clean the water and air, and produce a society with greater equity, which will also be a society of greater trust, because all studies show that while there is greater equity, there is greater trust among people, such that we can overcome the challenges of the next few decades. This won't be easy. We can't promise people liberty with abundance in the old story of modernity, which was a great story. I love that story. That was the story I was trained on as an undergraduate. That's where history should be heading. But can we find an alternative angel of history who looks at altered hopes, who says to each of us, it could have been worse, but we tried and we worked together to create mutualistic cities, mutualistic societies, with a sense, a keen sense that even though those lives are hard, they are so much better than hothouse earth. So that's what I'm trying to work on now. I'm really grateful for your patience and your attention, although I can't see your faces. And I think now I turn it back to Michelle. Is that right?
That's right. And I think you can stop sharing your screen, and then we can get started with the discussion. So we have a very shy audience today. They haven't been typing questions into the Q&A yet, but I'm sure they will very soon. So thank you so much for your presentation and for telling us about your work in progress. I'm delighted that this gives me the opportunity to actually ask the first question, or maybe even first couple of questions. But I mean, the first question that comes to my mind is, how do the scientists you are working with react to this story you're telling?
In different ways, of course. I have been, as you know, Michelle, and it's partly through your support that I've been able to do this. I've been in meetings, for instance, in Berlin with the Max Planck Institute, which is trying to set up a geoanthropology institute, which puts together the humanities and social scientists with the scientists. And at these meetings, there are absolutely stellar scientists, people doing work that I am hardly equipped to follow, even in vague outline. But what interests me about so much of that work is that it keeps focus on the global level. And the idea is we've in some ways overwhelmed the planet. We have overwhelmed the Earth system. So now the idea is to master it more thoroughly, and this global sense. And that, when they talk about it, I must admit that my blood runs a bit cold, because none of us live in the global average. Nobody breathes globally averaged air or eats globally average food or any of the rest of it. And few of us feel as individuals that we are interacting with the global system. And so as someone who thinks about politics or about the arts or about what it means to be human, as those of us in the humanities do, I don't know a globally averaged human. And the idea that that story of mastering the planet is going to be compelling enough to people and will allow people to make the sacrifices they need to make is very unlikely. And so it seems to me that that tends towards a kind of rule by experts that will only lead to distrust and lack of buy-in. And I think we're seeing that in very practical terms in many ways in earlier meetings of the International Panel on Climate Change. And when I suggest these things to my scientist friends, to some of these scientist friends, they're intrigued at the idea that we need narratives, we need to talk about values, we need to talk about particular communities. That makes me very happy. And I'm now involved with a group at Leicester that's engaged in a mutualistic cities project, which brings together science. So that's working. On the other hand, the Geoanthropology Institute seems to be continuing along the lines of technosphere. So I think scientists are mixed. Some of them are taking on some of the work that those of us in the humanities are doing, and of course it's not only. But it's hard for them to hear what we are saying because our work is not data driven. I don't have numbers, and you don't have numbers either. So that's a problem.
Thank you so much. These questions are now starting to come in, and I have to start with this very short but very powerful question, which I'm sure is on many people's minds. What ended the Tokugawa era?
Yes, what ended the Tokugawa era? Yes, American imperialism, essentially. Matthew Perry came with his great big black ships and said, we're here, you've got to open up. We're interested in whaling, which was, of course, the oil of the 19th century. And if you don't open up, here's my big black ships. You've noticed those, haven't you? And so essentially the Tokugawa Bakufu collapsed, and some very, in many ways, brilliant leaders brought Japan very quickly into the modern age, and Japan avoided being colonized. But one thing I will say in response to this question, which I didn't bring into my story, was that Japan was, even towards the end of the Bakufu, beginning to face an unraveling, partly because there was greater lack of equity amongst the commoner classes. And so that the obligations that the wealthy peasants owed to the less wealthy peasants had begun to be undermined, that sense of obligation. So it wasn't, who knows where the Tokugawa Bakufu would have come if America hadn't showed up. So yes, thank you for that question.
Okay. And a question from our colleague, Professor Sharon Yoon, on a sort of related note, I think. What do you think is the biggest barrier to achieving the type of society similar to Tokugawa Japan? And are there any other similar examples in history?
Oh, Sharon, that's such a lovely question. The barriers are so immense. One of the things that allowed the story of modernity to work so well was that it promised people that even if things weren't great now, the future could be wonderful. History was going in the right direction. There was a move towards abundance. But how do you persuade people to buy into the idea that in the abstract, we're going in a terrible direction, but now we have to turn and accept the fact that our children won't live better lives than we will, that there's going to be a diminishment to what we can hope for. And Sharon, if you have any ideas, I would love to hear them. I think it's going to take extremely powerful storytelling. So I think there's that, which is, of course, what humanists are supposed to be good at. But I think what I am finding in my classes, and I'd be very interested to know what other people are finding in their classes, a lot of our students already know this. They're not convinced that they're on some sort of escalator to ever increasing abundance. And they're frightened because we're not talking enough about the real future that we're facing. And so when I teach my class on Green Japan, they seem glad for at least a model. But how do we get there? I think we start talking about this. I think we look at organic farming models. I think we look at economic models like degrowth. I think we begin to introduce these ideas into the conversation. And there's another part to that question about other societies.
Right.
Most of them are, that I know of, I'd love to hear about others, if anyone else knows them, are pre-modern. One of the most interesting examples is Australia. And there's a marvelous historian named Bill Gaddage who did works that claims that the Aborigine were not just living within the Australian continent, but they were actually managing that continent through their use of fire collectively to create open grasslands that allowed for game and protecting water sources. And his book on this is just extraordinary because he's using art and all these other resources. So that when the Europeans came and they looked at Australia and they said, this looks like a gentleman's estate with all these beautiful grasslands and all, what they were seeing was not nature, but the work of people, but the work of these Aboriginal tribes. So that too gives me hope. There are models out there, but they're not the models that were part of the modernist story. So we haven't been looking for them. So I'm hoping there are a lot more.
Great. There are lots of questions coming in now, but this one particular from Leah Bartuli, I think links to what we were talking about. So she says, because you said most of the examples come from pre-modern societies. So Leah says, it seems like a lot of the traditions that you were talking about are actually still part of Japanese culture today. So is there a revival of these ideas in Japan? Or are they still moving, or are they still operating on the notion of globalization and growth?
Oh, that's such a lovely question. Yes. I think there's two trajectories in Japan, as there are in many places around the world now. The Liberal Democratic Party, wants to, continue to grow the economy, wants to figure out how to create still more public works, more poured concrete. They're going into the Fukushima area with the idea that instead of rewilding that area, which is now irradiated, they're getting people to move back there. They want to put Olympic athletes there. So their story is very much the modernist story of growth, even as the Japanese population declines. But there are small city mayors who are beginning to look at the conditions in the future in their area. They're seeing that the population is declining and aging at the same time. They're seeing that you can't fill the economic growth gap by having yet another amusement park. That's just not going to work. And they're beginning to think of steady state towns or even degrowth towns. And architects are beginning to think about how you remodel cities so that you keep services on while areas are becoming less densely populated. And in fact, some areas, not very populated at all. So on the municipal level, we're seeing some movement there. And that's very interesting. And then, of course, you have a lot of alternative groups who are thinking, I'm going to go off and work on sustainable agriculture and create communities of abundance without affluence. So there are, I think it's true in other places in the world too.
And I think this connects to a question I'm seeing here from Julia Kowalski, who says, our colleague Julia Kowalski, who says, in the wake of the past year's events, there's been a massive upsurge in mutual aid and community governance in the US, from environmental reform to criminal justice reform. I was struck by your reflection on tensions in Tokugawa Japan between individual and collective. What lessons does this historical perspective offer those who would strive toward more mutual, collective modalities of governance in the present?
Julia, yes, I'd love to hear your views on this. I always feel these situations are a bit awkward because I'm this big head talking, and actually, I wish it was more of a conversation. One of the things that I draw comfort from is that even in American history, despite the rhetoric now of us as individuals and needing freedom not to wear masks and all that kind of stuff, when we look back at the history of the United States, there are moments when the rhetoric of community engagement, the idea of fair profit emerges. And I'm thinking now of the period in the late 40s and 50s when there was in corporate boardrooms the idea of fair profit, not maximizing shareholder value. They talked about very heavy taxes, indeed, for the people who were on the top, up to 80%. And the reason for doing that was the idea that America stood for equity and opportunity, greater equality of opportunity. And that is not that, so that language is not foreign even to the United States. And it seems to me that one of the things we need to do is rekindle that. And I was giving a talk similar to this last February in Oklahoma, which now seems an incredibly exotic thing to have done. I got on an airplane and all this stuff. Wow. But before I went to Oklahoma, I did some research on the history of Oklahoma, as one does, and it turns out that they had one of the fiercest um, collective agricultural movements in the country. So this place we think of now as resistant to ideas of communal action used to have a very proud tradition of doing exactly that. So I do think that history is a place, of course I wouldn't I? I do think that history is a place to look now.
Actually, I think it's literature. But
Okay, we can arm wrestle someday. Yes, no, I'm not. Of course, literature is part of this. Literature is the. I'm actually rereading Giants in the Earth, which is about Norwegian settlers of the Great Midwest. Exactly. So literature, yes.
yes, well, if there's time left later, I might ask you something about stories and storytelling. But I wanted to raise a question that's been submitted by, I hope I pronounced the name correctly, Devin Maas, who says, is the avoidance of hothouse earth and the promotion of liberty really mutually exclusive? Isn't it possible to incentivize sustainable living through policies such as carbon taxes and green energy subsidies, rather than dictate how people must act?
I've given that a lot of thought. And I think one of the great problems of that approach is that it is really siloed thinking. The way we are talking about climate change now is to focus on not all greenhouse gases, but CO2, and particularly emissions from energy production. So we ignore emissions from agriculture, from concrete, from methane, and we have a metric for energy production. And so, for instance, one of the things, news articles I'm sure everybody saw, was that China has declared that it's going to go carbon neutral by, I think it's 2060. But if you look at the fine print there, or the not so fine print there, you realize that that kind of thinking doesn't take into account a lot of things. First of all, they're going to double their energy use, double their electricity production, which is, of course, producing heat, even if it's not producing carbon. And they are still 16% of that is going to be fossil fuels. So it's not really carbon neutral, even in that narrow sense. But they're talking about things like more big dams, but they're not measuring the concrete. They're also not measuring the biodiversity loss that comes with the huge lakes. They're not talking about the removal of topsoil. We only have about 60 more years of topsoil to feed ourselves with on the planet. We can't afford to remove more topsoil, use more topsoil. The same goes for things like solar panel or wind panels. They're not counting the kind of destruction of the landscape or biodiversity that comes from searching for rare earth minerals. So it's not that I'm against those initiatives for carbon reduction, but I think they need to be viewed not as benefiting corporations or individuals, but incentivized by things like carbon neutral taxes, so that the benefits are put back in a check to everybody. So you pay higher taxes at the gas pump, but then you get a check which will help redistribute income. So I think that we need to move away both from the siloed thinking that just looks at one of these aspects of the Earth system, and as we move to correct those problems, we find ways to create greater social justice at the same time. And that's a very long answer. There's obviously a lot more to say about that subject.
Okay. There's a question that just came in from Caitlin Jacobs, and it comes back to what you were saying about, promoting humanities or being active in the humanities in a setting that mainly values numbers and statistics. And she asks if you have suggestions for Notre Dame's approach to sustainability and climate, or if there are any things that you would like to see happen here, specifically here at Notre Dame.
Well, Rachel Novak is doing such a fabulous job. And now we have Roy Scranton's Environmental Humanities Center. And in Rachel's work with our undergraduates, she's bringing together the humanities and the sciences very deliberately. I think that's very important. And I think, well, of course I would think this. I feel like I'm getting on I feel like I'm a missionary sometimes for this. I don't mean to sound quite so emphatic. But one of the things that we just need more conversations on campus about teaching for the real future, preparing our students for what's really coming, opening their eyes to the very fabric of our campus, to ask questions like, do we need these lawns, which are deserts for so many species? Or is there a way in which the very grounds of Notre Dame might become regenerative of biodiversity? Are there ways in which we can reimagine, and students have been involved in this, the food systems on campus? Is there ways we can restructure the timing of our classes throughout the day such that it's easier for students with long science labs to take humanities classes, which sometimes conflict, or for the scientists on campus whose work is evaluated differently from the work of humanists, for those metrics that somehow come together so that it's more in the interest of scientists to work with humanists and vice versa. A lot of that decision making is above my pay grade, but I think it's beginning to happen on Notre Dame in very exciting ways, but there's just a lot more chat, a lot more conversation to have.
Thank you so much. And I sincerely hope that those conversations will take place and that humanists will have a strong role in them. Interesting question here. And again, I apologize if I mispronounce the name, from William Coview. Professor Thomas, thank you for your insightful presentation. What would a successful outcome look like in your mind over the next 5, 10, 50 years? How does a transition to a Tokugawa-esque society begin? And he adds, as a young person, I have more hope that the solutions will come from the bottom up as citizens demand response to climate-related problems as opposed to from the top down.
Oh, I love this question. And of course, I don't really have an answer. I'll tell you what has worked for me in my classes. I teach a class both on the Anthropocene. I teach another class on Green Japan. And oftentimes, particularly in the Anthropocene class, the news is so devastating. I look at my students' faces and I think, oh my gosh, yeah, I've got to answer the question that you've just posed. Um, and I believe too that it's from the bottom up. And a lot of my students do as well. And one of the most exciting things that happened last fall is that I brought in a young friend, a farmer, who is part of the Appalachian sustainability movement, college educated, who decided to have a 10-acre farm. And first he worked for the novelist Barbara Kingsolver's farm. She has a place out there in near the place I grew up, Abingdon, Virginia. And Jason became farm manager for her farm. So he learned the skills of organic farming and it works in the network of sustainable farming to try to put that kind of food into our food systems. And now he has his own 10-acre farm. Well, he came by Zoom to my class. Oh my gosh, I just felt like he should take over. I should step back and let him teach the rest of the class. My students were so excited about the prospect of actually having careers that would turn the trajectories into cycles. And he talked about not just farming, but about the social justice work, about having community gardens, about getting a little bus to go around to people in the back of the hills and bringing them to work in the garden, but then realizing that they didn't know how to cook. They've been living off, junk food, the cheap food. So they go home with a bag of vegetables, but the rutabagas and all would be left on the front porch and they wouldn't be. So they had got cooking classes. So more and more of that kind of work from the bottom up. So a couple of my students are enthused about even going and working on Jason's farm, apprenticing. Another way my students came at it was that one of them already had a job. He's in business analytics with Kroger's. Okay, he's doing things in that direction. But it turns out that Kroger's is in this area and is helping to support sustainable food. And so he's interested in figuring out how to connect this corporation with local sustainable agriculture. So whether our students want to build from the bottom up or come from the top down, both ways you can do it. So I've got another student who's in Amazon and he's in accounting. His goal is to try to figure out how Amazon can account for its carbon footprint, for instance.
Great, thank you. So we have about 2 minutes left. I'm going to paraphrase a question from Jessica McManus Warnell, who of course has done a lot of work supported by the Liu Institute on specifically the Fukushima disaster in Japan. And she says, what worries you the most and what are 1 or 2 reasons for optimism? So in 1 minute, let's focus on the reasons for optimism. What is your final message to your audience today?
Well, Jessica's leadership in the Fukushima project has been sterling. My reasons for optimism are my students' understanding of the challenges they face. That is my greatest reason for optimism. And I think too the political activism of the fall, that so many people I knew got involved in getting people out to vote, in simply recovering the will to democracy. So I hope those are reasons for hope. I hope they're strong enough reasons for hope. But thank you, Jessica.
Well, thank you, Liu. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation and for being so generous with your time and your ideas and discussion as well. And thank you to our audience for being here and for asking all such wonderful questions. If you haven't done so yet, and if you're on our mailing list, check your inbox for a very exciting announcement of our first ever Asian American Distinguished Lecture by the wonderful Aijen Poole on March the 11th. And that will be live streamed. That won't be a webinar. That will actually be live streamed through our website. So please have a look at that announcement. And for any other information about the Liu Institute, visit asia.nd.edu. Thank you and goodbye.